All right, this afternoon we begin our 12th lecture in this series on church history. And today we're talking about the Reformation, specifically the Reformation in Germany. Before we get started, maybe I should just ask a question. Do we want those windows open? Is that going to be too drafty?
That would be fantastic.
Okay. We remind ourselves that Martin Luther was a somewhat obscure monk, a parish priest, a university professor, whose protest over the sale of indulgences, and that protest was expressed in his 95 Theses, which we know he wrote them out, perhaps he nailed them to the church door at Wittenberg. These 95 Theses and the protest that they embodied instantly ignited long-standing complaints against the Roman Catholic Church, especially against their hierarchy. And so the Roman Catholic Church began to respond to Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. It began with the Archbishop of Mainz. He was alarmed, he was annoyed, and he forwarded the documents to Rome in December of 1517. And he requested that they put some kind of control on Luther. And at the same time, he said, let's calm down these guys who are selling the indulgences without any class. With such disregard to decency, these guys. Because let's remind ourselves that the selling of indulgences, as it was done in Luther's area and other areas as well, it was pretty crude. It was a show. And the guy said, okay, let's calm down the indulgence sellers and let's do something about this troublesome monk, Martin Luther. At the same time, there was a tendency within the Roman Catholic Church to regard this problem as just a squabble between the Augustinian monks and the Dominican monks. One thing I didn't tell you, so I certainly can't expect you to know it. It says this guy John Tetzel, this seller of indulgences, he was a Dominican monk. And it was very common for the monks of different orders to sort of squabble amongst themselves, right? To call each other bad names, to think that they were, your order's no good, you monks are no good, we're the good order. And so since Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk, and Johann Tetzel was a Dominican monk, it was very easy for these people to say, oh, it's just another example of monks getting into an argument. Soon, there were some counter theses presented by defenders of the Roman Catholic Church, and that they were presented before a Dominican audience in Frankfurt at the end of January 1518. So a few months after the 95 Theses had been put up, there were some counter-theses defending the Roman Catholic practices. But when copies of these counter-theses reached Wittenberg in March, a bunch of excited students of Martin Luther got together and they publicly burned the counter-theses. In Rome, the Pope didn't seem to care much about this. He thought that it was just another argument, a bunch of monks. He told the leader of the Augustinian order to kind of calm these guys down, and he didn't think much more about it. Luther ended up writing a expanded version, an explanation of the 95 Theses, because they had gained such attention, and he felt that he had much more to say on the issue. Then, things progressed on from there. Luther debated Johann Tetzel, the man John Tetzel, who was the guy selling the indulgences. And then he debated the renowned scholar John Eck. And John Eck, a noted Catholic scholar of his time, formally charged Luther with heresy. Eck came to Wittenberg when Luther had just left to attend some business regarding the Augustinian order of monks in Heidelberg. In his absence, Eck contended with a guy named Andreas Karlstadt, who was an assistant to Martin Luther. Karlstadt was concerned to defend the Wittenberg program, and he really jumped into the argument. He produced 379 theses. In some of these, Eck was publicly criticized. And so they continued to press against Martin Luther and his associates, and things didn't progress, things didn't get resolved at all. Now the cardinal who had responsibility over this part of Germany was a guy named Cardinal Cajetan. Cajetan was given his command from the office of the Pope, to bring Martin Luther to Rome for a heresy trial. But the political environment favored Martin Luther. You see, Martin Luther lived in Saxony, and Frederick the Wise was the prince over Saxony. This is one thing you have to understand that's curious about the structure of Germany at this time. Germany at that time was the farthest thing from a unified German state. It was the collection of dozens of small principalities. And some of the princes over these smaller principalities had a lot more authority than some of the other princes. One of the princes who had more authority than many of the others was this guy, Frederick the Wise. He was one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire, which meant that whenever it was time to choose a new emperor, he had a critical role in the selection. Therefore, the Pope could not afford to antagonize him, and neither could the emperor. Therefore, because Frederick the Wise protected Luther, and because Luther lived in Saxony, the Pope could not pursue Luther as aggressively as he wanted to, because he was protected by a powerful political man, Frederick the Wise. Now, as a result of this, Luther was commanded to a personal interview with Cardinal Cajetan at Augsburg. So Luther didn't go to Rome, that's what they originally wanted, but Frederick the Wise said, no, basically, my boy's not going to Rome. It's too dangerous. But Luther did agree to go to Augsburg. He arrived there on October 7th, 1518, so you're talking about 11 months after the 95 Theses. And he arrived with an imperial safe conduct promise. The discussion moved from indulgences to the discussion of the relationship between faith and sacramental grace, and then they got in an argument about the meaning of the treasure of the merits. They started discussing more obscure, not completely obscure, but more obscure things related to medieval theology. Basically, Luther offended the cardinal greatly at this debate. And the cardinal commanded that Luther leave his presence, and he told him, you stay away until you're ready to unconditionally recant. Do you know what it means to recant? It means to deny your previous beliefs. Well, while Luther waited uneasily after this council, his Saxon counselors reported rumors that he would be taken in chains to Rome. Eventually, he was sort of bundled up, hidden, and fled the city. So now he wrote an appeal to the Pope, to an ecumenical council, and a full defense of his actions to the prince. Cajetan, meanwhile, lost no time in denouncing Luther to Frederick or some of the other political leaders to try to get more and more people to side with him against Martin Luther. Next, in about 1519, a very formal debate between Luther and Eck was set for the summer of 1519 in the city of Leipzig. Eck was a very skillful debater, and he forced Luther into a corner of association with John Huss. You see, Eck knew what he was doing. What he did was he basically, through the debate, he backed Luther into a corner where Luther had to admit some kind of connection, some kind of partnership, at least philosophically, with John Huss. Well, once Luther did that, then all Eck had to say was, well, he's a condemned heretic of the Catholic Church, and he was burned. That's what should happen to you as well, Martin Luther. And so it was a very dangerous thing for Luther, this debate with John Eck. It was a difficult thing. And he was convinced that Eck won the debate, even though he wasn't right in his arguments. So Eck went back to Rome, being basically a winner against Martin Luther in this debate, and he came back with a papal bull. The papal bull was issued on June 15, 1520. The papal bull that said, Exsurgio Domini, or Lord cast out, against the 41 articles of Luther's teachings, followed by the burning of Luther's writings in Rome. Eck and the humanist diplomat and Cardinal Girolamo Alejandro were entrusted with the task of taking the bull around the cities of Germany. So basically, People thought, all right, Luther's been condemned as a heretic. And they didn't use that word, but his teaching has been condemned as wrong. We've got an official papal declaration to that effect. From now on, we know that this is done. We'll just have to publicize it, and popular appeal will fade away from Martin Luther. He'll be regarded as a criminal or heretic, just like others. Luther was also mocked with broadsheets and pamphlets. But Eck and Alejandro were shocked to see how popular Luther had become among the German people. He preached and wrote more and more in the common language, and he genuinely touched people. For example, on the left side of the screen is the bull against Martin Luther. It says, Bulla contra erros Martin Luther. In other words, the bull against the errors of Martin Luther. But then on the other side, you see sort of a pamphlet that was made in support of Martin Luther. There, you see him dressed as a monk, right? He's still a loyal monk. He has his doctor's clothes on. I mean, he's a doctor. It shows he's an educated man. And it says at the top, from the Babylonian captivity. And it talks about the difficulties and the sufferings of Martin Luther, painting him as a strong, kind of bold character, standing up for the people against the oppressive Pope. Well, on Luther's part, there were the very defiant tracts of the summer of 1520. The first of these, a real manifesto, was called To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. By the way, these are some of the things against Luther, mocking him, broadsheets against him. You see him here on the left. Here's a picture of Martin Luther as being a devil with horns on him. And then on the right, you see him wearing many different heads, as if he's a false guy who changes his story all the time. So these are all broadsheets against Martin Luther. So Luther submits this great document addressed to the Christian nobility of the German nation, and he addressed it to the rulers of Germany, princes, knights, cities, and so forth, under the young Emperor Charles V. It argued that in this crisis, people needed to come to a new resolution of the Bible, a new understanding of it, and again, to no longer support the Roman Catholic Church in the same way. The second treatise, the Prelude concerning the Babylonian captivity of the church, was intended for clergy and scholars. He published these documents, standing his ground and making it against the Roman Catholic Church. On December 10th, 1520, the students in Wittenberg lit a bonfire before the Elster Gate in Wittenberg, and they fed the works of the Pope attacking Martin Luther to the flames, including the papal bull, Exsurgio Domini, or expel him, O Lord. Against which, a very suitable threat to the Pope, they said this as they cast these papal documents into the fire: because you have corrupted God's truth, may God destroy you in the fire. And this was heavy. You see Luther more and more being pushed to make a line where there was no resolution between him and the Roman Catholic Church. Now we have to say, Luther never intended to make a break with the Catholic Church. Never. He considered himself a loyal monk and a loyal Roman Catholic. He didn't consider himself a revolutionary. But yet he had some principles upon which he would not bend. And when the church would not accommodate those scriptural principles, Luther would not budge. Luther was like a rock that could not be moved. And therefore, he was not going to give up. And the more that the church pushed against him, the more Martin Luther stood his ground and refused to be moved. Even to the point where he would burn the papal documents condemning him as a false teacher. That's a heavy thing to do. To take papal documents and burn them is a real way of showing your disdain and your anger towards the Roman Catholic Church. Now, why was Luther able to do this? Well, a big part of it was again, as I said before, because of the fundamental fragmentation of the German lands. Here you see how divided the lands of Germany were. Every one of those little things you see on the map was its own little principality. And some of them were governed by more than one prince. In other words, sometimes one prince would have authority over a couple different territories. But this whole thing in Germany at this time was real fragmentation. Okay, that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was that in Luther's particular place, Saxony, he had the benefit of a real powerful political protector. This is Frederick the Wise, the one who was Luther's political protector. Without this guy, Luther probably couldn't have done what he done, at least on a human level, we can say. And so it's fascinating to see how this man had no great love for the Catholic Church, even though he considered himself a loyal believer in Roman Catholic. He supported Luther vigorously in this fight. By the way, it doesn't seem that Luther and Frederick the Wise ever met. Perhaps they met once or twice, but it's not like they were buddies planning strategy together at all. It wasn't the case one bit. This is one of my favorite pictures depicting this idea of how indebted the Reformation was to the political protection of men like Frederick the Wise. Here you see a painting, and of course in the front of the painting is Frederick the Wise, and he's decked out with the gold chains and the fancy robe. It shows his wealth, it shows his status, it shows his influence, and then behind him are some prominent reformers. There's Martin Luther on the left, there's Philip Melanchthon on the right, Martin Bucer, some other important reformers of those times. But the important thing to see is that Frederick the Wise is standing in front of them in sort of an aggressive stance with his two hands on his two swords. The message from this picture is very plain. I'm protecting these guys. You got to come through me, Mr. Rich and Powerful, with my hands on the two swords if you want to get to these guys. That was very much the reason why the Reformation could go forward in Saxony as it did before. Yes?
What was Frederick the Wise's main motivation for protecting them? What was his gain out of it?
The gain for Frederick the Wise was that in this constant battle between the popes and the kings, or the popes and the princes, a guy like Frederick Wise had just had enough. And so there were, there had always been, 100 small challenges to papal power. Well, not so small, right? We've seen this in the past, how the kings would challenge the popes. Well, Frederick the Wise saw this as an opportunity to really challenge the validity of the papal influence in his domain. Now, in January of 521, the Pope issued a bull of formal excommunication against Martin Luther, though it was some months before the condemnation was received throughout Germany. So finally, 1521, the Pope has had enough. He excommunicates Martin Luther. Meanwhile, the Imperial Diet, now that's spelled just like diet, D-I-E-T, but what it means is like a council or a congress. The Imperial Diet was meeting at Worms, and there was a great deal of lobbying for and against Luther. In the end, Frederick the Wise was able to obtain a promise from the emperor that Luther would not be condemned without a hearing, and that he should be summoned to appear before the Diet. Because it was a very difficult decision for Luther and for Frederick the Wise to make, to say, should Martin Luther go to the Diet of Worms and present his case? Because they wanted to hear it, they wanted to put the man on trial for heresy, they want to investigate his beliefs. But what is very powerful in their memory as they're doing this? The memory of John Huss, and what happened to him almost 100 years before. Nevertheless, Luther felt that God wanted him to do it. He felt that the political protection afforded to him by Frederick the Wise was enough. And so they decided to go ahead and do this, but it was not an easy decision. Because Luther had to make a long trip from Wittenberg all the way down to Worms, which actually was a journey of at least a few hundred miles and would take many days. Luther would be very vulnerable because most all of that time he would be out of the safe confines of Saxony. But he decided to do it. Luther decided, and he began to the journey in April of 1521. Undeterred by the news that the emperor had ordered his books to be burned. and was meant to be the safe custody of a heretic to go to Worms to be tried, turned out to be something like a triumphal procession. I don't know how to describe it to you any more than just simply to say that basically, Luther going to Worms, he was greeted in all these cities and villages that he stopped in along the way. He was greeted like a rock star. People loved Martin Luther. They loved that he was making a stand against the corruptions of the Roman Catholic Church that they were just positively sick of. And so in the midst of all of this, he comes through these villages, he's greeted with great acclaim, and as I said before, when he comes into Worms, finally, the city goes crazy. Again, it's like a celebrity coming in because they're so excited about the heroic stand that Martin Luther is making against the Roman Catholic Church. They said that he was attended by a cavalcade of German knights, and the streets were so thronged that Luther's enemies were absolutely furious at all the good attention he was receiving. But very soon was going to start the Diet of Worms, this council where Luther was going to be confronted by the emperor, not the Pope wasn't there, but the emperor was there and many, many officials of the Holy Roman Empire. Now again, this must have been an incredibly intimidating experience for Martin Luther. He sat in front of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, who, by the way, was the son of Isabel and Ferdinand of Spain, the ones who sent Christopher Columbus off on his errand. He sat before Charles V, the emperor. He sat before 24 dukes, 30 archbishops and abbots, 7 ambassadors and papal nuncios. In all, there were 206 persons of nobility or high rank sitting in judgment of Martin Luther. And who was presiding over the council? The guy who beat Luther in that one debate, John von Eck. This was a very, very nerve-wracking situation for Luther. So first, Eck pointed to a stack of books and asked Martin Luther if he had written them. Second, Luther looked at the books and said, yeah, I guess I wrote those. Yeah, those are my books. Secondly, he asked Luther, will you retract what you've written in those books? Now, to the second question, Luther summoned up all his courage, all his wisdom, all his strength. First question, are these your books? Yes. Second question, do you stand by what you've written in these books? And Martin Luther said, with all of his strength, can I have a little bit of time to think about it? That's really what he said. He said, you know what? This is a big moment for me. I don't want to say something wrong. I don't want to say something rash. Can I have a day to think about it and we come back and talk about this tomorrow? And so, Eck granted the request and they adjourned for the day. Luther went to his room and prayed most of the night. The next day was April 18th, 1521. It was perhaps the most important day in Martin Luther's life. He gave his conclusion here, this statement, on the second day of the Diet of Worms. As he began his answer to the question, again the question was, will you retract these writings? Luther started talking. He goes, listen, you got to understand, and those things that I've written, they're all different. Some of the things that I've written, they're works of edification for people in their Christian life. And that I don't need to recant. I don't need to retract those. And for some of those things that I've written that have been really works of attacking what I believe to be false doctrines, I'm not going to apologize about that. Even though I think I need to explain some of these things, and Luther starts going on and on and on about it, Eck interrupted him. He said, stop. You give us a simple, plain answer. Do you stand by what you've written here in these books or not? So Martin Luther answered. He said, therefore, your most serene majesty and your lordships, since they seek a simple reply, I will give one that is without horns or teeth, and in this fashion, I believe in neither pope or councils alone. For it is perfectly well established that they have frequently erred as well as contradicted themselves. Unless then I shall be convinced by the testimony of Scriptures, or by clear reason, I must be bound by those Scriptures which have been brought forward by me. Yes, my conscience has been taken captive by these words of God. I cannot revoke anything, nor do I wish to, since to go against one's conscience is neither safe nor right. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen. As soon as Luther said that, the council exploded into an uproar. People were shouting at one another. They were screaming, either favorably or unfavorably. Luther and Eck started shouting at one another. And some people say that Luther left the room with his arm lifted up in a gesture of both triumph and relief. The emperor also left the proceedings. He was disgusted. The next day, the emperor told some people that he could not see how a single monk could be right and the testimony of 1,000 years of Christendom be wrong. That was basically the attitude. How can one monk be right and 1,000 years of Christendom be wrong? But again, Luther was allowed to leave safely on April 25th, much to his great relief, right? You have to figure that he figures there's a big target on his back and that he's going to be killed. But he's allowed to leave the city safely. But soon the emperor placed a ban on him. What a ban meant was this. Was that anybody who gave food, drink, or shelter to Martin Luther could be tried with high treason. And if somebody happened to kill him, nobody would really mind that much. Basically, the emperor declared open season on Martin Luther. He didn't put a price on his head. I don't want to exaggerate and say he did that. He didn't do that. He didn't command that he be executed. But basically, he said, it's open season on Martin Luther, and anybody who gives him food, drink, or shelter can be charged with high treason. So immediately after his bold stand at the Diet of Worms, Luther was on his way back to Wittenberg. Well, I say immediately. It was really actually several days later, April 25th. But as soon as he could leave the city, he did. But yet, on his way back to Wittenberg, Luther was kidnapped, so to speak. He was secretly kidnapped and protected by knights loyal to Frederick the Wise. And they did it as if they kidnapped him. Because basically what they wanted is they wanted Martin Luther to disappear. They wanted nobody to know where he was. They wanted nobody to know where he was going. So it was as if they kidnapped him and took him away secretly. Now, when I say kidnapped and secretly, Luther was fine with all this. He understood it was for his own good and for his own protection. But as far as the world was concerned, Luther simply disappeared on his way back to Wittenberg. So what did he do? Well, when he was captured by these bandits, so to speak, on his way home from Worms, he was taken safely to a castle right outside the city of Eisenach in Germany. Now what's interesting is Eisenach was the same city where Luther spent some years as a student when he was a boy. But they took him to this castle known as the Wartburg in Eisenach, a beautiful place that we take our students to every year. And it's really impressive to see the Luther room there. And then the ruse allowed Frederick not only the ability to protect Martin Luther, but it also allowed Frederick to escape the charges of harboring a heretic. If the emperor were to ask Frederick the Wise, "Where's Martin Luther? Why are you protecting him?" What would he say? "Boy, I don't know where he is. Isn't that weird? He just disappeared off the road on the way back to Wittenberg." And so Luther was safe, but much of the world thought that he had been secretly arrested or murdered by the emperor. In this fortress among the beautiful forests of Saxony, Luther remained until March 1522, not quite a year. He spent that time, grew out his beard. He took the name Junker Jorg, or Knight George. He dressed as a layman. He grew a beard, and he put on weight. He just basically kicked back in some respects. But in other respects, he worked harder than ever before. What Martin Luther did that was of real note there in the Wartburg was he began to translate the New Testament from the original Greek into German. Working in this room at the Wartburg, he studied Greek, polished his Greek skills, and then began translating the New Testament. Luther had an incredible genius for language, and he was a very well-traveled man around Germany, and so he knew the many diverse dialects of Germany probably as well as anybody. And he was able to make an amazing literary accomplishment, making one German translation of the Bible that really unified the diverse dialects of Germany. You could say that the modern German language began with Martin Luther and his translation of the New Testament. Most notably, he produced that in 10 weeks. He translated the entire, it's sometimes called the September Testament, because he did most of the work in September. It was an amazing work showing Luther's intellect and his ability as a translator. That's the room. If you were to see it today and go visit the Wartburg, it's really a wonderful place to go. And you can see the very same room in which it is said that Martin Luther, well, no, it's not said, it's known that Martin Luther translated the New Testament in that room. That is the famous room where it is said that he threw the inkwell at the devil, and the inkwell stained the wall, and then people would come. It was a very early tourist attraction. I mean, not long after the death of Luther, people were coming to this room, and they were tearing little bits of wall off of the thing where they thought there was an ink stain. And then through the centuries, the people who owned the castle were more than happy to throw a little more ink on the wall. You know, every time the old one was worn away, so that people would come back and keep seeing the ink stain on the wall. I don't think that Luther actually threw an inkwell at the devil in this room, but this is what he said, and this is why people get that legend. Luther said this: "I fought the devil with ink at the Wartburg." Well, I mean, obviously he meant his translation, but you can see how somebody would mean to think, well, he threw an inkwell at the devil. No, he fought the devil with ink at the Wartburg. Well, this was an amazing work that he did. Now, during his months at the Wartburg, Luther made a secret visit back to Wittenberg in December of 1521. When he got there, he was appalled at what he saw. That's the beginning of Luther's New Testament. Luther was appalled at what he saw. He thought things... excuse me, I got to back up here. I got ahead of myself. On the first visit that Martin Luther made back to Wittenberg, he thought things were going okay. But as soon as he got back to the Wartburg, he started hearing reports that things were getting crazy in Wittenberg. And basically, what they said is that, listen, Martin Luther, this Reformation that you have started in Wittenberg, other people are taking it over and leading it into directions that shouldn't be taken. And basically, the guy that Luther was concerned about was this guy, Andreas Karlstadt, this associate of his. You see, Karlstadt, who was a monk, who was an associate of Luther's, first of all, he said, "I'm getting married." Secondly, at communion, on Christmas Day, he administers communion both with the bread and the wine to the common people. Then, he starts doing his ministry dressed as a layman, not as a monk. Then he starts attacking images in violent tracts and very strong language. He denounces vows, he denounces masses, and he demands a liturgy done in the common language. Basically, these were reforms that Martin Luther may himself have come to in time, but what Andreas Karlstadt was doing was he was pushing everything ahead at a much faster speed than Martin Luther wanted to go. So Luther found Karlstadt's approach to be legalistic, and he made matters of necessity out of things that should be matters of conscience, at least in Luther's opinion. So this was a real problem. In addition, Wittenberg started becoming a magnet for people who wanted to escape the tyranny of the Roman Catholic Church. And on the one hand, it was great They got a lot of great intellects, a lot of great excited young students. There was a real energy in Wittenberg over those years, but there were also a lot of crazy people who came. In particular, a group of people known as the so-called Zwickau prophets in 1521 came. And they spoke of great dreams, great revelations, perhaps sort of hyper-charismatic people. We might think of them today. And they came and started influencing Karlstadt and other people in the city. All these things got back to Luther. Again, this was after his first trip back to Wittenberg. They got back to Luther when Luther was there, hiding out at the Wartburg. And in March of 1522, Luther left the Wartburg to come back to Wittenberg again. And there, he started preaching a series of sermons that he thought was going to balance out the too radical pursuit of changes and a speed of change that was dangerous. Now, Luther deliberately preached these sermons dressed in his monk's habit because he wanted to show you can be spiritual and remain a monk. Luther's trying to show, I'm not trying to overthrow everything. I'm still a monk. I'm still devoted to the Augustinian order. I'm just objecting to the Roman Catholic Church at these particular places. This was a real slap in the face to Karlstadt and to those people who wanted to radically change things. Now, in these words, in these sermons that Luther developed, these very strong sermons that he delivered at Wittenberg in March of 1522, there was a very clear difference made between Martin Luther and those who wanted to reform things even more radically than Martin Luther. Luther absolutely deplored the use of violence. He said, let's let the Word of God be the agent of reform, not the sword. Luther believed that revolt or rebellion could not take place without incredible destruction and the shedding of innocent blood. He believed that the real idols are in the hearts of men. And he said, listen, you may have your opinions about this statue or that statue that people regard as idols in our church, but what you have to do with idolatry is change it in the heart, and then people won't care about the statues anymore. And then he believed that the speed of reform had to take into account the unconverted and the weaker brethren. From this time forward, Luther had to fight a war on two different fronts. On the one front was the Roman Catholics, who branded him a heretic because of his disagreement with the Roman Catholic Church. But on the other front were people that he called fanatics. Schwärmer is the term that he used in German. One of the results of the Wittenberg crisis was to slow down the practical reforms. And even though Luther introduced things later on that were sort of along these same lines, he didn't want to be seen as giving in to what he regarded as the radicals. So from this point on, you have a separation in the history of the Reformation. You have what can be called the Magisterial Reformers. That's guys like Luther. The Magisterial Reformers are those who reformed with the power of the state on their side, with guys like Frederick the Wise backing them up. Then you had other reformers known as the Radical Reformers. Andreas Karlstadt would be an early example of a radical reformer. They just said, hey, listen, the Bible says it, we're going to do it, we don't care what the consequences are. Luther was more like, whoa, we've already accomplished so much, let's not lose what we've already accomplished, and let's take the rest of it really slow. Now this brings us really to about the year 1525, which was a very important year. In the year 1525, in many ways, was a watershed in Luther's career. He married Catherine von Bora in June 1525, which was a big deal. Luther at first didn't want to get married. Don't forget, he was a loyal Augustinian monk. And he had decided that he had given his life to celibacy and he was not interested in getting married. But he decided to marry Catherine von Bora, and this had an incredibly good effect on Luther's life. Because Catherine von Bora added a lot of things to Luther's life that previously he didn't have. The story of their romance and their marriage is very charming. It's a wonderful story. She was a former nun who was let out of her monastery, and she escaped her monastery in these days of the Reformation when things were breaking down and things were breaking loose. And when they brought her to Wittenberg, her and the other nuns, they tried to marry them all off to people in the city, and they tried to marry Catherine von Bora off to somebody, but she refused. She said, I only want to marry Martin Luther. Well, Luther refused. He wasn't interested in getting married. But eventually he did. And as I said before, it turned out to be a great thing for him. And so, she proved to be an admirable wife and a very good businessman to him. His home meant a great deal to Martin Luther. And it was an emblem for him of what a Christian should be, to include domestic life as part of a real Christian life. And so it was a very important thing for Martin Luther, his marriage and what transpired in his home after that. Now, the other big thing that happened in 1525 was known as the Peasants' War, or the Peasants' Rebellion. You see, it's a little hard for us to understand how strong the bounds of medieval society were upon the common people. These were serfs, these were farm workers that lived in virtual slavery. And a lot of times, the authority of the church was used as one of the tools to keep them in slavery. So, when Martin Luther made significant attacks against the authority of the church spiritually, it's no surprise that many people felt that it was time for a revolution politically and economically in the culture as well. Now, in Germany and in Europe at that time, it was not a terribly unusual thing for the peasants to revolt from time to time. But this, inspired by Reformation teaching, especially inspired by the fiery radicals like Andreas Karlstadt and another guy, Thomas Müntzer, especially inspired by these guys, thousands upon thousands of peasants organized an army and tried to revolt against the present order. And at the Battle of Frankenhausen, 50,000 peasants were killed in the battle. Now, before the uprising was stopped, most of that year's crops, hundreds of villages, 1,000 castles and monasteries were all destroyed. Nearly 100,000 people total died in this war. Protestant ministers were hanged by Catholic princes, and the peasants, more than anything, felt that they had been utterly betrayed by Martin Luther. So that was a huge phenomenon in 1525. A further thing in 1525 came the open break between Martin Luther and the great humanist Erasmus. There had been differences between the two men for a long time, and they had traded correspondence. But yet Erasmus felt that Luther was worse than the problem of the Catholic Church. He thought he was a violent, dogmatic theologian, the kind that he had always detested. And then also in 1525, Luther gets married. You have the incredibly bloody peasant rebellion. You have his open break with Erasmus. And then in 1525, finally, Frederick the Wise died. Apparently, the two men met only once, but Luther owed a lot to this prince. Now, the new elector, the new prince of Saxony, his name was John, and John was also a devout supporter of Martin Luther, so he didn't have to worry about that. Well, people wondered for a long time, could there be a reconciliation between Martin Luther and the Roman Catholic Church? And there was actually one more great meeting between Luther and the Roman Catholic officials at Augsburg in 1530. It was the last attempt to patch things up between Martin Luther and the Roman Catholics. Now, Luther didn't personally attend this meeting at Augsburg because it was too dangerous for him to travel outside of Saxony to do it. But his colleague Philip Melanchthon presented the Lutheran views there as closely and as non-offensively to the Roman Catholic views as he could. And it was good that he sent Melanchthon to do it. Martin Luther was a fighter. He was a rebel. He was an in-your-face kind of guy. Melanchthon was much more of a quiet scholar, a kind of guy to try to find common ground, Melanchthon was of a different sort. But even with Melanchthon presenting the case, they couldn't come to an agreement, and the Roman Catholic Council still demanded concessions that Luther would not make, and the division became final. Now, as for Luther's later life, after the Diet of Augsburg, the participants were unable to achieve a compromise. Charles V gave the Protestants until April of 1531 to submit to his and the Catholic Church's authority. Then he declared that they had been defeated. Therefore, Luther kept battling back. He didn't stop. He wrote, he wrote. He preached, and he kept on doing the work. After a serious illness in 1537, he was almost a chronic invalid, prematurely aged, rarely free of discomfort and often in pain, and he brought his teaching career to an end with his lectures on Genesis. In the last decade of his life, Luther saw the papacy gaining strength again with the preparations of the Council for Trent and the Counter-Reformation. He saw the growing menace of Catholic military might. He wrote some very argumentative and vicious books at the end. Such things as Against the Anabaptists, Against the Jews, Against the papacy at Rome founded by the devil. The most violent and the most coarse of his writings came at the very end of his life. It's very interesting to see Martin Luther's writings regarding the Jews towards the end of his life, because he wrote vicious things that were later quoted by terrible anti-Semites such as Adolf Hitler, saying about how Jews should be persecuted. Tragically, though, Luther came to this position after starting in his ministry being very conciliatory towards the Jewish people. Early in the Reformation, Luther held open arms out to the Jews. And he said that we should be ashamed at how the church has treated the Jews. But at the end of his life, he wrote these small booklets, these tracts, that were absolutely vicious against the Jewish people. It's just my opinion. I don't really seek to prove it, but it's my opinion that Luther suffered from some kind of dementia in the last few years of his life, and he wrote these tracts, these violent, angry, spitting mad tracts. He wrote them partially under the effects of this dementia. I have a hard time explaining why a man who was so open and friendly to the Jews in the early part of the Reformation could be so violently turned against them at the end of his life. And so, in his last years, Luther was often ill and depressed. It may have been medical, but it was also spiritual, because Luther was flat out discouraged that his work did not have a greater impact on the daily life and morals of the common people. In many ways, Martin Luther launched an important and necessary theological reformation, but not a true revival. The true revivals would come later, very much based on Martin Luther's work, but Luther himself was very depressed that his teachings did not strike a greater common chord with the common people. His health was particularly bad at the end. The ulcer on his leg reopened. He had throat and ear infections. He had trouble with kidney stones and arthritis and heart problems and digestive disorders. His daughter Magdalena died, and that sent him into a deep, deep depression. He mourned his daughter's death. He saw the plague sweeping through Wittenberg, and he believed that it was the faithfulness of the Germans that had brought all this upon the world. In the summer of 1545, Luther told Catherine to sell their goods. He was angry and disillusioned with Wittenberg and wanted to move, but the University of Melanchthon and the mayor all persuaded him to stay. Early in 1546, Luther was asked to go to Eisleben, where he was born, to mediate a quarrel between two young and arrogant princes, Count Albrecht and Gebhard of Mansfeld. He was old and ill, but he was their authorities to whom they owed obedience, and he set off in the snowy winter. Catherine was deathly afraid when he left, and then he left to go make peace between these two princes. He made the peace between these two princes, and then on the way home, he died. He died on February 18th in the same village where he was born, Eisleben, and his body is interred in the Church of All Saints in Wittenberg. A few final points here. First of all, the Luther House in Wittenberg is an outstanding place to visit. There's also a Luther House in Eisenach. This is the one that you see on the page. But the Luther House in Wittenberg, where he lived first as an Augustinian monk, and then later on as a married man and leader of the Reformer, outstanding place to visit. We should also remember that Martin Luther was an accomplished musician who wrote some wonderful songs. He said that music was second to theology in importance. But at the root of it all, Luther was a man who was profoundly converted by the Spirit of God. This is what he says. Did God call me on account of my holy life, or on account of my Pharisaical religion, or on account of my prayers, fastings, and works? Never. Well then, it is certain that God did not call me on account of my blasphemies, persecutions, and oppressions. What prompted him to call me? His grace alone. That's the kind of believer Martin Luther was. Now, I would also say, at the same time as I'm filled with a lot of respect and admiration for Martin Luther, I mean, Martin Luther was essential. He was the man who had the right doctrines, the right courage, and the right political protection. He was the man to lead that all-essential Reformation in the Christian world. However, I must say that I can greatly sympathize with those in Luther's day who wanted to take his work even further and apply truly biblical principles to everything, including infant baptism, including the relationship between the church and the state, and the organization of the church itself. Luther started something great, but as Charles Spurgeon would later write, he said, what a blessing it would have been in Luther's time if the Reformation had been carried out completely. Great as the work was, it was in some points a very superficial thing, and it left deadly errors untouched. I would agree with that. And Luther ended up struggling both against the people who wanted to take his work further than he wanted to, and those who wanted to take his work back to as if it had never happened. Luther was caught in the middle between those two camps.